into timely advice from experts as we discuss all things leadership and technology. You'll get the inside scoop on better business practices, from making the most of your technology to leading a company with your head and heart. Pull up a seat with Marco CEO Jeff Gao and President Doug Albrechts. Let's Tech.
Welcome back to Let's Tech. Your host, myself, Jeff Gao.
And your other host, Doug Albrechts.
Doug Albrechts. Welcome, Doug. Good to see you again, man, like always. Today we're going to talk about something really difficult, hard stuff, hard decisions, difficult decisions that, you know what, can lead to some of our finest moments or some of our greatest failures. And how we respond totally matters. Decisions that have potential consequences. That's difficult, right? That's hard decisions. Not everyone defines difficult the same way, do they, Doug?
No, because difficult to me can mean a whole different thing than difficult to you.
Right, because you can always defer to me if you need to, right?
That's
and
correct.
So, or vice versa, of course. And some of it comes with experience, and gosh knows I've got a lot of experience, like a lot of years behind me.
Yes,
and,
you do.
One of the most difficult decisions I've had to make, okay, you go back and as part of our topic today, what was a difficult decision I had to make? In 2015, after being an ESOP for 30 years, we decided to sell the company. That was probably my most difficult business decision. And it was difficult because the impact it was going to have on the stakeholders, the broad range and reach internally as well as externally, our communities, well, you can about imagine, right? And a lot of the stakeholders had different opinions. So how was that all going to play out? Well, the good news is it worked out pretty well, I think. But it was all about people and money.
Isn't it always coming back to people and money?
It always does.
Yeah. I thought your most difficult decision was to hire me.
You know what? I shouldn't even really say this, but that was actually an easy decision.
Really?
It really was.
That's the first time this is great. So our guest today has been an unbelievable asset, not just to Mr. Jeff Gao, but to me and to the rest of the executive team here at Marco. And he came in at a really difficult time, as you know, because not only did he get promoted promptly because he's so good at what he does, but then COVID hit.
I think that made a lot of things difficult. Very appropriate. We're talking about what we are too, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So pandemic hits. He's a numbers guy, but you know what? It's so easy to label a finance guy, a numbers guy. But he's an inquisitive guy. He joined Marco as a controller in 2017, and he was promptly promoted to VP of Finance in 2019 and became our CFO this year, and he's been invaluable to me. Great guy. James Bainbridge is here with us today. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Well, thanks for coming. I'm going to ask you what has been the most difficult decision you've made, but what's interesting, and I'm sure Jeff wants to know this, is it after you were made CFO or before that time?
It was before I was named CFO, because that's a rather a recent thing here. But
so what was it? What was it?
Well, it goes back to what you were just talking about around COVID. So, as we got into March and we saw what kind of was happening overseas, and then it seemed like all of a sudden it was like, hey, it's here in the U.S., we had to make a lot of difficult decisions. And it wasn't necessarily one big decision, but a series, I would say, of difficult decisions around how to steer the business during that time. We knew that the decisions we made would have effects on, our people and our customers. And if we, overreacted, they could potentially impact our people and customers more than we would have liked to. And if we didn't make the proper decisions or react strong enough, they could have major impacts on the business. And as I think about what made the decisions we made during that time difficult, like you guys mentioned, it all comes back to people and money. So it was really tough on, making sure we were making the right decisions for our people and our customers. But what really made that difficult was, in this, it's kind of a cliche term here, but it was really unprecedented. And it felt like things were changing by the week, by the day for a period of time there. And so we just had to adapt, and, we had meetings and discussions more frequently than we might on some other discussions. And we also had to adapt how we gathered data and the type of data that we looked at.
Were you nervous when that was going on? I mean, like you're kind of going, you can make it seem really simple, and I'm going, And our job is to make sure people don't know we're nervous or think we're nervous, right? And but yet you kind of can, right? You know, you're like you said, unprecedented. You're going like, gee, I wonder how this is going to play out.
Well, it's interesting. It's a lot easier talking about it now that we know ultimately where we are right now. But I know for a period of time, you know, every day was getting worse. The stock market was dropping. Yeah. People were talking, hey, you know, what's going to happen to the economy? So I would say absolutely we were nervous. But I think the approach we took to it was, you know, one step at a time. And we had a road plan on how we were going to make decisions and when we were going to make them. So I know we, you know, had a lot of discussions on, hey, here's what the outlook currently looks like. If it gets worse, here's some things we're going to start to think about. And if it gets better, you know, as we hoped it would get and stabilize, which it did, you know, we'll stay the course.
You know, one thing, Jeff, you say a lot is a stronger Marco is going to be a more resilient Marco down the road. And I think some of the things we did probably made some of those decisions, at least the decisions we made prior to COVID to do just that, I think maybe made that decision not as difficult as it could have been.
Hey, what was your most difficult decision? We've been talking about ours here. What about you, Doug?
Well, you know what, I'll tell you.
Okay, that's good. All right.
There you go. Thank you very much, everybody. Good night. This one's interesting for me because, James, you didn't know me, but Jeff got to know me very well. It's unfortunate for Jeff. But he sat on the advisory council at Sharp, and a lot of people didn't know when I took the job. Sharp is a very, very healthy, successful company. I want to get the record straight here, Jeff. But when I took the job in 2011, that wasn't quite the case. And you know, one of the things we had was a very convoluted distribution and logistics system that was eating up a lot of capital. So it was a working capital nightmare, and the company itself was in quite a bit of trouble financially in Japan. And so one of the things I had to do, and Jeff, you were on our council at that time, is I had to make a decision to move to what we'd call 3PL or VMI. We like to joke around on our podcast, James, about all these neat business terms that
acronyms that we
don't mean anything to anyone. Basically outsource our part of our back office and outsource our logistics. And so when I look back on it, I was early in the job and people said, if you do this, you're going to get fired. And I talked to people like Jeff, and Jeff, you were one of the first ones who said, you got to do this, man. I remember you saying that.
Well, you know what? The industry was pretty complacent in how they were operating. And here comes this guy, Doug Albrechts, and goes, hey, here's what we're going to do. We're going to change how we deliver products and services to our customers. And we're like, this should be interesting to watch from the sidelines, kind of, right?
And you're a financial guy, so you know when you're tying up money, and you're tying up money in inventory or just the supply chain in general over a long period of time, that's money that can't be freed up to do other things for you in your business. And so you know, I was new. I was very uncertain how the long term was going to go, and I was really worried about the execution. I knew it was the right move for the business, but man, I knew if I got it wrong, it was going to impact people's lives. But I had to drive costs out of the model. We had to increase efficiency, and we knew long term it was going to be better for the Jeff Gow's of the world, the Marcos of the world, and I think a consensus was that was the case, and that was a very difficult decision. It kept me up at night. I made it. I owned it. And it worked, and I'm taking all the credit for it, I guess. It shouldn't be.
You know, to your point earlier, those decisions when they're difficult like that are hard decisions. You know, you said it could impact people, but you know, if it didn't go well, it would have impacted you. Would have been one of the people.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? I mean, you could make a bad decision, and you know that can be very impactful in your own career. Well, in not a good way.
And you took some key steps navigating the sale of the company, right?
So as we were navigating the sale of the company, and I said that was one of my biggest decisions that we ever had to make. Is it was more about at the time trying to figure out what the landscape looked like if we didn't do this, and so some of it was more about if we didn't do it, what might things look like. And so as we weighed those key consequences of not selling, it helped us to see the bigger picture and to clear the path for what we were trying to do. So I think that sometimes looking at a non-decision, or if you don't make that decision, that has consequences too. So you know, it's easier to kick the can down the road than it is to make a tough decision. And we did that. What was the defining step, by the way, that you took that made a difference, James?
Yeah, so if I go back to my the COVID example, you know, there as a numbers guy, and I take no offense in being called a numbers guy to the comment earlier, but so there were, you know, there's a lot of things we look at from a business standpoint that we historically looked at a certain frequency. So we looked at, you know, incoming orders, frequency of service calls, some efficiency metrics. But we used to look at those either monthly or weekly. When we got into COVID, we realized, hey, this thing is changing so quickly. The data that we're currently getting isn't meaningful. By the time we get it, it's stale. Things could have, changed tenfold since that. And so we spent a lot of time on the front end, and our IT team was instrumental in this, but getting real-time info. So we took a lot of those data points around sales, service, some financial metrics, and we got those to be pretty close to real time, so that when we were meeting on a daily basis or a very frequent basis, we had information to talk about, and we had data that wasn't just anecdotal. We weren't watching the news saying, hey, things are horrible in the economy in general, making decisions off that. We made it very specific to our business.
I felt those when you were going through them. Every day we met multiple times. I mean, you guys certainly got to know each other pretty well. Both of you in new jobs, pretty much at the time.
Yep.
So
Right.
lots going on. How about you, Doug? What was a defining step you took that made a difference as you were navigating this whole logistics move? You're making it sharp.
Well, first off, it took about 9 months, so it wasn't a quick thing.
That's a project. Yeah.
That's a project. So, something like to the nature of what we did, because it took, it was going to be a lot of upheaval, easy for me to say, in the organization, that you had to go to the sharp board, and that required a great deal of fortitude. You had to have a great deal of confidence, and you had to sell, and you're not only were you selling yourself, but you had to have conviction, because if you didn't have it, and you didn't stay on your theme, and you didn't communicate very clearly why it was so important to the business, it wasn't going to work. And I think more importantly, the last thing, which again, you played a part of, was we had to rally the advisory council. So the customers, our biggest customers that we sold to, we had to get them on board, and that you sat in those meetings.
I think I did an endorsement.
You actually did
at your national convention. I recall doing that
because you were one of the only. By the way, you were one of the only ones that heard of Tech Data at the time.
That's a good company. Good company.
Absolutely. So for you, we kind of left you out here. What is the first step to take when facing a difficult decision?
It used to be really, really hard, but now it's gotten a lot easier. I just call Doug.
Amen.
That's what I do. I
brother.
just call you, man.
Amen. Amen. That's the right move. James, what about you?
Well, I was going to
Can't
say
get a
this- I was
serious
gonna
answer
say
out of Jeff. So
I was going to say the same thing. So I guess I'm going to have to come up with
well,
something
good. I
different
guess
here,
we're
but-
done here.
No, so I think the first thing when making a decision is to really make sure that you understand the decision you're going to have to make. A lot of times, when you get into issues and you're trying to solve things, I've found that you look at things very, there's a specific thing that happens that brings the decision to light. And if you don't step back and ask good questions and keep asking why, you can tend to make too narrow of a decision or focus on something that doesn't fully address what you're trying to solve. The other thing I like to do is just, I'm a data guy, so I like to get as much info as possible. So whether that's actually, concrete data points or just talking with a lot of different stakeholders. And I also find that, by asking a lot of asking why and asking a lot of good questions, you start to realize that there's potentially people that need to be involved with the decision that didn't come up initially. So for me, it's all about really defining what you're trying to solve and then making sure that everybody that should have a voice has a voice in the decision.
Well, you talked about questions, and what are some of those key questions?
Yeah, so, and we see this a lot on a lot of the decisions that I'm faced with, have to do with finances. And a lot of times you have to separate the short-term consequences from the long-term. So, one of the things I like to ask or think about is, if we were going to make the best long-term decision, what would we do? And then also getting into the short-term consequences, because as you know, what's right long-term may cause some short-term pain, but if you don't address it, it's just going to linger on for a really long time. The other question to ask is, are the stakeholders aligned? And so that's where I do a lot of information gathering, talking to a lot of different people, and, getting different viewpoints. And then you also kind of figure out, okay, who are going to be the main people making the decision? And are we in agreement, or do we have to get in a room and talk it through and come up with some way to be aligned?
Those are really good ones. I got a few that I kind of like to ask, and it starts like this: why wouldn't we do this? That's a good way to figure out what the consequences might be collectively. Why wouldn't we do it? And who's impacted? And then I like to find out who's in what camp. who supports this, who's a sponsor, maybe who's an anti-sponsor. And again, these are on bigger decisions. That would just belabor the decision itself. It was on insignificant daily decisions, but kind of aligning the camps and who's in favor, who's against, and how we might work toward a resolution on that. So
yeah, it's questions are so important, and asking them and you're not always going to have the answers, right? But to be able to come up or formulate some kind of an answer that can help you get there. I mean, I'm always amazed because I think the two things that stick out for me, you ask those questions, but once you have some answers, leaders have to have conviction, they have to have compassion, and I think as we sit around this table, we're often expected to make really difficult and tough decisions in a very quick manner, and that can be that can put a lot of pressure on us, right? And I guess the big question I have just in that is, how do you overcome that? Because James, Jeff can sometimes be really demanding with the time sensitive stuff, right?
I know.
So how do you overcome it? What do you do?
Well, the first thing is I've found that people tend to think, especially around some of these big, difficult decisions, that they're more urgent than they really are. And so, not to say that there aren't things that are really time sensitive that need to be addressed immediately, but really understanding what the time frame is and when you need to make a decision by. And a lot of times I've found that if you really think about that, you have a little more time and you can gather the data to make the decision. Not to say that you shouldn't make a decision, because that it is easy if you don't set a time frame and stick to it to just not make the decision. Once you make the decision, you need to be decisive and move forward. But I think understanding the time frame and giving yourself the ability to again, some of the stuff we've talked about, give yourself time to talk to all the stakeholders, to pull the data so that you can make the best decision possible.
That's a great point. I think some people like to rush it, and sometimes you don't have to rush it. Maybe we set the deadlines ourselves. Even when someone says to you, it has to be done by Thursday. I mean, why Thursday? Maybe we should understand, because if you had an extra day, maybe it becomes a very good decision versus making a rush decision that can become a bad decision. And then I guess really try to get to what is really the time sensitivity. I mean, I know you see this all the time, Jeff.
I see it all the time. And, especially when you're working on, I do a lot of acquisitions. Sometimes I intentionally put self-imposed urgency in there because I want somebody to make the decision, because indecision becomes, prolongs the process, and it usually isn't as good of an outcome. So recognizing negotiations are time sensitive, but waiting and patience can also work in your favor. It can be very favorable. But I think the key point is you need to be decisive, and you actually do need to make a decision. You cannot vote maybe. And oftentimes a way to bring things to an end is say, this is a yes-no question. Go around the table and say, and you can't vote maybe, because everybody always goes, or not everybody, but oftentimes a delay tactic is, well, it depends. I hate when somebody starts that way, especially if it's something we need to be decisive on. So that might be a thing to put to a vote. This is a yes-no question, and you can't vote maybe. Obviously, emotions can threaten our ability to make good decisions. We have to keep them out of that if we can, and they can get the best of us. But James, because you work with data a lot, and by the way, that's been really, really helpful having you as a part of our team when we're making decisions, is to have that data, whether it's financial, whether it's specific metrics. But the point is, data is an important part of making a decision. Tell me a little bit about how data helps you in your daily decision making.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, a lot of the decisions I'm involved with are financial in nature. And, as we look at numbers, finance guys are really good at creating models, right? So you sit and you create this model, and then you think through all of the different variables that play into that. And ultimately, when you're making a decision and looking at data, you want to be able to say, here's what's going to happen if we make this decision. That's rarely the case, though, right? There's multiple variables, and they can range. You can put what you think is the most likely. But one of the things I really like to do is to do some sort of analysis to say, if we assume this is going to happen on the low end, what does that result in? And if things go picture perfect and we get exactly what we think we're going to, where does that get us? And then you can sit back and you can say, okay, here's what we think is going to happen at this point in time. If we knock it out of the park, which everybody hopes we do, here's what the number is going to be. But if things go okay but not perfect, here's what it's going to be. And is that a decision that we're all comfortable with and a result that we're all comfortable with?
Good advice. That's really good advice. And difficult decisions mean that emotions are going to come into play. It happens every time. And a good way, I think, to prevent that and perhaps to manage them is to start with your own emotions. And you need to take your own personal feelings out of it. And that's really easy to say, but really, really hard to do.
Yeah. And I think that's the most common mistake that leaders make. I just have to, they let their emotions get in the way and they let their personal agendas impact the decision. And
well, see, people, I find that people have a hard time taking themselves out of the decision. I got a recent example.
Yeah.
We talk about health insurance. It's really difficult, especially as a group, if we're trying to make a decision on a health insurance plan, and we know how complicated that was if everything was laid out perfectly. But it's hard sometimes if you have a circumstance. Maybe you're a single employee. Maybe you've got an existing health condition that might be favorable if you impacted the decision a certain way. So those are just examples, of simple things that are hard decisions that get impacted by those emotions, and more important, keeping your own biases in there.
Yeah.
So.
And what is my spouse going to think if I vote this way and the program changes? Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So that's a great point. Have either of you found yourself in a situation where you just couldn't, you got too many emotions involved and you couldn't separate your personal opinions from the decision that needed to be made?
Yeah, I'll start. I mean, I think we'd be lying if we said that hasn't happened. And recognizing it is an important part of being a leader, which we talk a lot about. You have to, I've had times where you take a step back and you need to check, your personal motives and is that, and you can't let it get in the way. And you just can't do that as a leader, right, Jeff? I mean,
totally. That's an essential skill in leadership. It really is. You got to keep logic in play and agendas out of it. And even though we know we use terms, and I use them myself, I've got a specific agenda. But point is, you got to keep logic in play here. And what differentiates good leaders from medium leaders, I think, is the ability to do that. And that's really what defines good leadership: is taking their own personal interest best they can out of play.
All right. Well, switching gears a little bit, I think we've all made decisions that, in hindsight, we look back and say that wasn't the right decision. What did you learn from one of your biggest failures? Either one of you.
Oh, geez. That's a hard question, but I think I always deflect back to blaming someone else.
See, I knew you were going there.
Yeah, I just deflect the blame whenever possible.
Yeah, and act like it didn't happen, right? Like, what
Right.
the heck? Yeah, that's really good. And I could write a whole book on that, my friend. Let me see, a good title would be How to Drive a Bus Over Your Peers. No, that's not good.
That would be a good one.
No, that's not a good one.
In all
That's not a good one.
seriousness, though, I've had many instances, and a good example. Back in the retail office products days, we made decisions, and frankly, it didn't work. We had to pull ourselves out of that. We kept trying to fix something that you're just not sure how to fix it yourself, and so you just lingers on, and you should have been more decisive earlier. And oftentimes, when you make a decision to exit, almost always, God, I wish I'd have done that sooner. Nobody ever says we should have dragged that out a couple of more years, do they? So it's resurrecting something. You try really, really hard to try to resurrect something because you got an interest in it, and it just doesn't work. And so I guess that's where I find myself on numerous occasions getting stuck.
Yeah, I've got one too that actually comes to memory right now because it kind of sticks with me quite a bit. When I left Sharp, I know I left an industry that I loved and enjoyed, and you didn't realize the grass wasn't necessarily greener when you leave. And, maybe I was running from something versus running to something.
I'm glad you came back into the industry.
I'm glad I came back. But in hindsight, that was a really difficult decision. And one if I had to take back, at the time I wouldn't take it back, or I would actually not have made the decision to leave. But I probably wouldn't be sitting here doing a podcast with JB and JG. so it's good. And but how about you, James? You've had to have a few of these, I would imagine.
Yeah, as I look back on regrettable decisions, and especially within the finance function, we know numbers, but we rely on other people to really know the business. And so one of the bigger mistakes I've made is just not bringing other stakeholders into the process soon enough in the decision-making process. So you kind of get to the end and you think you've got all the best data and you've got it completely thought out, and then somebody catches wind that something's going to happen. They're going, hey, I was never consulted on that, and you got this completely wrong. It's a lot easier to have those conversations ahead of that being brought up and in front of a group of people, or making the wrong decision and finding out afterwards that if you would have talked to somebody, you could have gotten some information that would have been super helpful.
So what you're referring to is you may not have had somebody in the conversation because they weren't ready to be in the conversation. It may have been a confidentiality thing, right?
That's definitely part of it. And
so how do you balance it? I mean, how do you balance not being able to bring them in, but you got to keep the information confidential?
Yeah, so I really, there's a scale around decisions and how confidential the info is. So on some things, you want to keep it quiet and you don't want everybody to know, but if it got out, it wouldn't be a huge issue, and you can be a little more lenient about who you bring into the conversation. And then some things are on the complete opposite side of the spectrum. When I think about that, as you work somewhere and as you get to know people and you have interactions with them, who can be trusted, who's a little more chatty.
Who to include, who not to.
Right.
Right, exactly. And so you really rely on that, and you kind of come up with a go-to list of people that are subject matter experts in a couple different areas, and you tend to find yourself going to those people.
Your circle of influence, your circle of trust. We talk about that often as, we feel comfortable and confident as we share and make decisions with our most trusted advisors. But, I've been doing this for a long time, longer than both of you put together, actually, because James, how long have you been in business? How long have you been in the business world here?
A little over 10 years.
Yeah. So, well, you're getting pretty experienced for a young guy, by the way. And Doug, you're over 20, 25? How many?
Ooh, God, 27, 28?
Well, way to be exact. Yep, right.
Yeah.
There you go. So
Rounding the other
either way, I said I was I had about as much experience as both of you put together, and I'm pretty darn close because I've been doing it here at this job for 36 years, so a long time. But do you find, does it get any easier?
I find that I get more comfortable making them, but I wouldn't say it necessarily gets easier. And I might even argue that it shouldn't get easier, because when you're impacting, people and money like we were talking about, you really want to make sure that you're taking it very serious and you're putting the appropriate level of effort into the decision-making process.
Yeah, good advice. Good advice. How about you, Doug? Getting easier for you? 27 years in?
Yeah, I'm still doing the math on that. I don't know if it's 27 years, but I've been married for 26. I think I've been working before I'm married, so I think I'm off a bit. But if you're going to be a leader, you have to be good at this, right? And I think we can all agree to that. And I think once you get into your routine, some of the things James was talking about that he did, I think those are some good examples, and understand the importance of getting it right certainly makes it more fulfilling. And naturally you can show conviction, and you can get that compassion, and that's part of selling difficult decisions. If you do those things, it usually has a tendency to work out the right way.
Yeah, good decisions lead to fewer regrets and failures, don't they? And in leadership, you need to be good at making those difficult decisions, or facilitate making good, difficult decisions. So a no decision usually becomes a bad decision. And advice from peers that you respect can be really, really helpful. You talked about that circle of influence, and you got to be decisive on it, because I think what happens so often is decisions get dragged out, they don't get implemented, they don't get executed in real time. Right now, is we're navigating COVID and the pandemic. It's first and foremost.
So anyway, that's good, Jeff. And I guess I would say that the one word we don't want to use here is indecision. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Indecision. This indecision is bugging me. That's a great line, I think, of a Clash
Let's
song.
not make a decision today.
Yeah.
Let's do everything we can
Exactly.
not to be decisive.
So I'd like to thank our guest here today, Mr. James Bainbridge, so he can go back and start crunching some numbers, right?
Right. I'm glad you guys let me out of my office for a while. It was fun to be here.
And making some really difficult decisions. So that's another wrap for Let's Tech. And subscribe. Tell us what you think. Right, Jeff? We like to hear feedback. Get involved. Tell us who you'd like to hear from. Give us some topics. Give us something. This has been fun.
Let's Tech.
Let's Tech.